Vivian Cooper was 68 years old when life decided to remind her that there were still lessons that neither the years nor experience could fully teach. She had spent almost 4 decades teaching children to read, to add, and to find patience where others saw only frustration. She lived in a small wooden house on the outskirts of Portland, surrounded by old rose bushes and framed photos of generations of students who still called her Mrs. Cooper. Her routine was as precise as the grandfather clock in her living room: tea at 6, the news at 7, and silence afterward. But on that November afternoon in 2010, the sound of the doorbell shattered her calm like thunder in the middle of winter. Standing at the door was her daughter Rachel, pale-faced, red-eyed, and holding a toddler clutching a stuffed animal with tattered ears. "It'll just be for the weekend," Rachel said before disappearing into a gray car that didn't even wait for her to finish her sentence. The boy, Ethan, was barely 5 years old, and his gaze held a disturbing mix of distance and fear. He didn't respond to questions, ate nothing but dry bread and lukewarm milk, and every time the phone rang, he covered his ears and screamed with heartbreaking desperation. In the first few days, Vivian felt like a teacher without a book, without a guide, facing a new language she couldn't translate. She tried to speak to him gently, then firmly, but the boy's silence was an impossible wall to climb. Only when she noticed him meticulously lining up his spoons on the table, did she realize that this order was his way of understanding the world. From then on, instead of correcting him, she decided to accompany him. She bought the same bread, served the same yellow cup, and placed the spoons in exactly the same position every day. It was her first act of love for a language she hadn't yet mastered: consistency. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into a silence that grew ever more burdensome. Rachel didn't call, didn't write, left no trace. Vivian spent her nights checking the landline, convinced it would ring at any moment, but all she heard was the insistent ticking of the clock. Ethan, oblivious to the abandonment, lived in a universe of patterns. He counted the steps between the sofa and the window, turned around 3 times before sitting down, organized his pencils by shade, not color. At first, this seemed eccentric, but Vivian soon understood that these rituals were his refuge from the chaos. In the absence of answers, Grandma learned to observe as if the child were a book, slowly revealing itself, word by word, gesture by gesture. And so, amid repetitions, fears, and small advances, a silent relationship began to emerge, a kind of invisible pact between routine and affection. It was one winter morning that Vivian understood the magnitude of what she was facing. Ethan woke up crying, wordlessly, trembling as if something had torn him apart from the inside. She hugged him awkwardly. She knew physical contact made him uncomfortable, but this time the boy didn't move away. He stayed there, his head on her chest, breathing in time with hers. It was the first moment of calm after months of uncertainty. In the silence of that early morning, Vivian thought that perhaps her life, dedicated to teaching so many, now had one final purpose: to learn. To learn to listen without demanding a response, to love without expecting reciprocity, to guide without imposing. Paths. And in that lesson she discovered something that neither books nor classrooms could teach. Love is also expressed in tiny gestures. As the months passed, the house began to transform into a small sanctuary of order and predictability. Every object had a specific place: the shoes by the door, the cups on the same shelf, the clocks always synchronized. Vivian understood that, for Ethan, any change was a storm. If the wind stirred the curtains or the bell rang unexpectedly, he flinched if the world were too big for his body. Then she did the unthinkable for a woman accustomed to commanding in the classroom. She lowered her own voice, stopped rushing the timing, learned to follow his rhythm. She discovered that silence could be as expressive as a conversation, that a sustained gaze could speak louder than 1,000 explanations. In those small concessions, a new trust was born, a bond that depended not on words, but on constant presence. One spring afternoon, as the sun filtered through the kitchen window, Ethan unprompted picked up a piece of paper and a pencil. He began to draw lines and geometric figures with a precision that astonished Vivian. They weren't scribbles, but repetitive, almost hypnotic patterns, as if his mind were translating something invisible. It was the first sign that, within his apparent disconnection, there existed a vast and structured inner world. Vivian put that drawing in a folder, convinced that one day she would understand its meaning. From then on, each new piece of paper Ethan filled out became a testament to his progress, a kind of dialogue between two souls who had learned to communicate without speaking. She looked at him and felt that somehow they were both saving each other. 3 years after that night, Rachel disappeared. Vivian and Ethan's routine had become so precise that any visitor would have thought the house ran like clockwork. They woke up at the same time, ate the same toast for breakfast, and went for walks along the same gravel path that bordered the garden. Sometimes, when the wind blew hard and made the branches rustle, Ethan would stop and close his eyes, as if trying to decipher a code hidden in the sounds. Vivian watched him with a mixture of admiration and tenderness. She had learned not to interrupt these moments. They were his way of understanding the world, his way of being at peace. And although he still didn't speak much, every small gesture of his was a whole conversation. The special school. The teachers were beginning to notice his almost obsessive precision with numbers and his fascination with digital clocks. One night, as they sat silently eating dinner, Ethan put down his cutlery and looked at her with a seriousness that disarmed her. "Why did my mom leave me?" he asked, his voice so fragile it seemed about to break. Vivian felt breathless. No teaching manual could have prepared her for that. She could have invented a pious story, but she chose the truth. Even though it hurt. "Because she didn't know how to help you," she replied slowly. There were no tears or shouts, just a long silence that filled the room. That was the first real conversation between them, and it marked the beginning of a new stage, one of mutual understanding. From that day on, Ethan began to look at her differently, as if he'd understood that his grandmother wasn't trying to replace his mother, but to protect him the way one protects something sacred and fragile. Over time, Ethan's question became a kind of invisible boundary. Before it, everything had been survival. After, understanding. From that day on, she began to trust her grandmother a little more. She began to accompany her to the garden, to watch her water the plants with slow, careful movements, to imitate her way of folding towels, and to follow her steps when she cooked. The house, once a place of echo and tension, was filled with shared routines, with a peace that can only be born from silent understanding. Vivian, who had taught hundreds of children to read and write, understood that this boy was teaching her to look at life differently. It was no longer about correcting or educating, but about accompanying the invisible process that transforms fragility into strength. The years passed without any news of Rachel. Sometimes Vivian dreamed of her, a blurry figure running through shadows, always too far away to reach. But each morning, seeing Ethan focused on a blank sheet of paper, she found solace. The boy had developed a fascination with calendars. He could recite past dates, foresee holiday patterns, and record the sequences he found in the numbers in a notebook. His logic was so impeccable that therapists began to notice something out of the ordinary. They said he had a hypersystemic mind, capable of connecting minute details that others ignored. To Vivian, he was just Ethan, her grandson, the boy who saw the world as a chessboard where every move made sense. And, although there were still difficult days, meltdowns, screaming, moments of isolation, she knew they were moving, step by step, toward a brighter place. When Ethan turned 10, he was no longer the scared little boy who dreaded the ringing of the phone. Now he sat in front of an old computer that Vivian had rescued from the basement of the school where he'd worked his entire life. The machine took minutes to boot up, but that was enough for him. Every click, every line that appeared on the screen fascinated him. He soon discovered how to reorganize folders, create shortcuts, and automate small processes. He didn't do it out of childish curiosity, but with the precision of someone trying to impose order on a chaotic universe. Vivian watched him without interrupting, sitting with her cup of tea, marveling at that mind that seemed to understand the language of machines better than that of people. He sees what others can't, he thought with pride and a slight fear, aware that knowledge can also isolate. Their relationship developed into a delicate balance between freedom and structure. Ethan needed everything to be predictable, but within that rigid framework, his creativity flourished. Every Sunday after breakfast, he organized the files on his grandmother's computer. Documents, photos, even recipes. He categorized them with names, dates, and color labels, as if constructing a time map. Vivian realized then that her grandson wasn't just organizing things, he was trying to make sense of memory, give logic to the past. Silently, she became his student. She asked him to explain how he made everything work better, and Ethan, in a slow, precise voice, taught her about commands, programs, and systems. It was his way of saying, "I love you," a love that wasn't spoken but manifested in every click. By the age of 12, Ethan had already mastered a technical vocabulary that many adults barely understood. He learned to program by watching old tutorials and reading forums. Silently, never commenting, like a spectator absorbing knowledge without needing applause. He modified the old computer until it became an extension of his mind. Vivian watched him work with half-closed eyes, fearing that this digital world would further distance him from the human, but at the same time, she felt proud. Her grandson had not only found a way to communicate, but also a purpose. The therapists began visiting less frequently, and although they still recommended strategies for social interaction, she knew Ethan was fine. He didn't need to fit in because he had already found his own place, his own language. It was on one of those silent afternoons, as the rain pounded the kitchen ceiling, that Vivian noticed he had changed. Ethan no longer avoided physical contact so much. He would hug her, albeit briefly, when something went well. Once, after finishing installing a program, he looked at her and said, "It works?" But he said it with a smile, and that smile, so rare and so sincere, was for her the reward of an entire decade of patience. She treasured that moment like one treasures. Deep inside, she felt that all the pain of abandonment, the nights of fear, the years of uncertainty, had served to lead her right there, to that tiny moment when a grandson and a grandmother understood each other without words. It was then that she understood that sometimes the greatest victory lies not in changing the world, but in learning to coexist with it. The passing of the years brought with it a new, almost ritualistic calm. Each day was a repetition that paradoxically kept them alive. Vivian prepared breakfast with the same precision. Toast, a yellow cup, and the blue plate Ethan preferred. He, for his part, turned on the computer and reviewed his to-do list. Everything was recorded: bath time, clothing, brands of food. Anyone might think it was an exhausting routine, but for them, it was a refuge. In that order, Vivian found stability. In that predictability, Ethan found freedom. Sometimes in the late afternoon, they would go for walks around the neighborhood. The neighbors greeted them with a mixture of curiosity and affection, little imagining that behind that silence lay a story of emotional survival. During his adolescence, Ethan began to display an intelligence beyond the ordinary. He understood not only computer systems but also patterns of human behavior. He analyzed schedules, gestures, repetitions, as if everything in life could be reduced to a logical sequence. At 15, when the world came to a standstill due to the pandemic, he saw opportunity where others saw confinement. He locked himself in his room for hours, working with a concentration that frightened Vivian. She listened to him type, move the mouse, mutter snippets of code, and sometimes feared he was getting lost in this digital universe. But she didn't interrupt him. She knew that great learning happens in silence. She just left his food outside the door, and before bed, she watched the blue light from the computer monitor filter through the door like a domestic constellation. One morning, as the clock struck 3, Vivian heard footsteps in the hallway. She got up in fear, thinking Ethan was having a breakdown, but found him in the living room in front of the computer, his face lit up by the screen and his eyes filled with something she hadn't seen since Rachel had left him: enthusiasm. "Grandma, I think it's working," he murmured without taking his eyes off the monitor. On the screen, lines of code scrolled as if they were coming to life. He had developed a system capable of detecting digital forgeries using cross-checking algorithms, something that even the adults at her technical school didn't fully understand. Vivian didn't understand the words, but she did understand the sparkle in his eyes. She sat next to him, saying nothing, knowing that she had just witnessed the birth of something that would change their lives forever. In the following weeks, the project grew. Ethan fine-tuned details, corrected errors, and validated results. He was methodical, almost obsessive, and every night he recorded his progress in a green notebook he kept locked. Vivian watched from the prudent distance that only a grandmother can have, non-interfering but always present, until one day, by pure chance, a computer science teacher discovered what he was doing. He was so impressed that he helped him officially register the software. When the news spread, the story of the young autistic man who created an anti-counterfeiting program went viral in the local community. Interviews, emails, and offers began pouring in from all directions. Vivian watched it all with amazement and a certain unease. She knew that success was a huge door, but also that sometimes behind the glitter, shadows lurk. In a matter of months, Vivian's quiet life turned into a whirlwind. The local press appeared in front of their house. Reporters asked about the coding prodigy, and neighbors spoke of them as if they were legends. Ethan, oblivious to the commotion, remained focused on improving his program. When a small cybersecurity company offered him $20,000 for the initial license, he showed no euphoria. He simply said, "That'll be enough to fix the roof." Vivian, through tears, understood that this young man didn't measure success in money, but in stability. However, recognition grew faster than her ability to manage it. Multinationals began to show interest, offering figures that seemed out of this world. At 16, Ethan sold his software for more than $3 million. With the money secured in an account supervised by a lawyer, Vivian thought they could finally live without setbacks. She dreamed of a future where Ethan could study, travel, even have the life Rachel never offered him. But just as the world was beginning to recognize his talent, the shadows of the past returned. One afternoon, the doorbell rang again, just like that time, years ago. Rachel stood at the door, her hair shorter, her skin tired, and a rehearsed smile. "I came for my son," she said bluntly. In that instant, Vivian's heart stopped. She knew, with a mother's instinctive certainty, that he hadn't come back for love but for money. And behind that smile, she sensed something colder: calculation. Rachel didn't return alone. She brought with her a lawyer in a dark suit and a thick folder full of documents. Seated in the courtroom, they unfolded papers with supposed receipts for monthly deposits, visitation records, and medical certificates signed by her. She claimed to have been present the entire time, just silently, so as not to disturb the child's progress. Vivian could hardly believe what she was hearing. The audacity of the lies left her speechless. The lawyer spoke confidently, citing articles of law and reminding her that, without formalized legal custody, Rachel was still the rightful mother. It was then that the fear Vivian had suppressed for a decade returned like a cold wave. It wasn't just losing custody. It was the possibility of seeing Ethan torn from her world, her order, her peace. That night, while Ethan slept, she sat by the window, staring at the reflection of the lights in the glass. She thought about everything they had built together, every routine, every achievement born of silence. How could the judicial system ignore 11 years of love, sacrifice, and perseverance? When the family lawyer confirmed that without concrete evidence of forgery, they could lose, Vivian felt her whole body shut down. In the kitchen, the clock continued to tick indifferently, but in the next room, Ethan quietly got up and sat down at his computer. "Let her talk," he said simply, without looking up. There was no fear or anger in his tone, only a serenity she didn't fully understand. The day of the hearing dawned gray, with a fine drizzle that seemed to foreshadow the outcome. Vivian arrived at the EAU courtroom with her heart in her throat, carrying a folder full of photographs, medical reports, and letters from Ethan's former teachers. Facing her, Rachel looked impeccable, a beige suit, subtle makeup, and the expression of someone who had rehearsed every word. For hours she spoke of her maternal sacrifice, of the sleepless nights, of the supposed efforts to stay close to her son. Every sentence sounded carefully calculated. The judge listened attentively, sometimes nodding. Vivian felt the story twisting in favor of the lie. The air in the courtroom was so heavy that even the clock seemed to tick more slowly. Then Ethan, who had remained silent, stood up. With the judge's permission, he placed his laptop on the bench. His hands trembled slightly, but his voice was firm. "I just want to show the truth," he said. Within minutes, he had access to his software and began analyzing the documents Rachel had submitted. The screen displayed dates, metadata, and digital signatures. Each file revealed its falsity, created just weeks before, copied and pasted from public forms. Murmurs filled the courtroom. Ethan didn't stop. He showed the real records, years of photos, emails, doctor's appointments, and calendars, all with verifiable timestamps. The evidence was irrefutable. Rachel tried to intervene, but her own voice cracked. At that moment, even the judge lowered his gaze. The lie had been exposed with mathematical precision. When Ethan finished his presentation, the silence was absolute. Vivian watched him, unable to move, as if time had stopped right there in that courtroom where a serene-eyed teenager had dismantled an 11-year-old charade with the same calmness with which he arranged his pencils. The judge called a recess, and Rachel, defeated, put her hands to her face. Vivian felt the tears she had held back for so long finally find their way. In that instant, she understood that her grandson had not only learned to navigate his own world, but also to defend both of theirs. When they returned to the bench, the sentence was clear: permanent custody for Vivian, immediate investigation for Rachel. For the first time in many years, justice spoke the same language as the truth. And if you've made it this far, you might feel the same way many people do when they hear stories like this. A mixture of sadness and hope, anger and tenderness. Tell me, where are you watching or listening to this from? I'd love to know. Outside the courtroom, journalists waited in swarms of curiosity. Ethan, uncomfortable with the noise, lowered his head and took refuge behind his grandmother. She hugged him, ignoring the flashes, the microphones, and the questions. They had nothing more to say. That night they returned home, exhausted but at peace. Vivian served dinner as usual, soup, bread, and the same yellow cup. Ethan didn't speak, but before going to his room, he left a note on the table. "Thank you for not giving up." Vivian folded it carefully and put it in the folder of old drawings, where it had all begun. The days following the trial were strangely quiet. Vivian expected a call, a new threat, some unexpected movement, but the silence was total. Ethan resumed his routine with a naturalness that moved her, waking up early, preparing his exact breakfast, and spending hours tweaking lines of code that seemed to float on the screen. However, there was something different about him. His gaze, once aloof, had become firmer, more confident. He no longer programmed to escape the noise, but to build something. A new purpose seemed to have been born within that young man who had once feared doorbells and echoes. Vivian watched him work and thought that, although justice had been served, the true triumph was internal, that of a child who had learned to transform pain into clarity. The money from the sale remained untouched, under the lawyer's management. Vivian insisted they wait, not rush. But Ethan, meticulous as ever, had a plan. He wanted to create a different kind of company, a space where people like him, autistic, introverted, brilliant minds who didn't fit the mold, could work without fear. He called it Insight Lab. He designed the logo, the website, and a selection system that valued logic and attention to detail over eloquence. Vivian helped him register the documents, recalling the years when she taught school forms. But now, she wasn't guiding a child. She was accompanying a visionary, and with each signature, with each piece of paper, she felt she was closing a cycle. The launch of Insight Lab was low-key, almost domestic. Instead of large offices, Ethan set up the center in the remodeled garage of his home. 3 desks, 4 donated computers, and a whiteboard were enough to get started. The first to join were young people with similar diagnoses, former therapy colleagues who had always been underestimated. Vivian watched them work and saw in each a spark of something the world hadn't yet learned to value. She made coffee, organized schedules, and without intending to, became the silent heart of the project. Meanwhile, Ethan dealt with codes, structures, and contracts, demonstrating that logic, when born of love, can be deeply human. In that small garage, solitude transformed into community. A year later, Insight Lab began to gain recognition. Companies that had previously ignored neurodiversity began hiring them to review systems and ensure software quality. Ethan never accepted interviews. He preferred to let the work speak for itself. Vivian, on the other hand, responded to emails politely, always remembering where they came from. "We are people who notice what others miss," she wrote in the message signatures. That phrase became the group's motto. Every time she saw her grandson teaching the new members, her mind flashed back to those days when he could barely hold a pencil, and she understood that sometimes miracles don't come with fanfare or noise, but with the perseverance of someone who doesn't give up, even when no one else is watching. Rachel was sentenced to community service at a support center for children with autism. At first, Vivian refused to even think about her, but time, that relentless teacher, softened the hardness of her heart. One day, as she left the supermarket, she saw her daughter through the center's window. She was sitting on the floor, reading aloud to a group of nonverbal children. Her expression wasn't one of arrogance or sadness, but humility. For the first time, Vivian didn't feel anger, only deep compassion. She understood that Rachel's punishment wasn't to clear her name, but to face day after day what she had failed to love. And in a way, that scene closed a cycle. The mother she once abandoned out of fear was now helping others avoid being abandoned. The evenings at Vivian's house returned to their usual rhythm. The grandfather clock ticked away, the smell of toast filled the kitchen, and the yellow cup remained on the table. Sometimes Ethan went out into the garden with his laptop, looking for patterns in the flight of birds or the way shadows lengthened at dusk. "Everything is connected," he would say without looking up. Vivian listened to him from the window, thinking about how much had changed and how little they truly needed to be happy. Life owed them nothing more. They had already found the essential, the love that is built with patience, the kind of love that seeks no reward, only permanence. One autumn afternoon, as the wind blew dry leaves across the porch, Vivian received a letter from the court. It was the official notification of permanent custody and the final closure of the case. The law, at last, reflected what life had already established years ago, that Ethan was, and always would be, her grandson, but also her greatest lesson. She put the document in a drawer along with his early drawings, those papers full of lines and patterns that she had kept without understanding their meaning. Now she saw in them the same structure that had sustained her days: repetition, constancy, symmetry. Everything she had once believed monotonous had become the key to her salvation, and she understood, with a gentle smile, that even the most rigid routines can contain love. That night, while Ethan was tweaking new algorithms on his computer, Vivian approached with a cup of tea and sat beside him. "You know," she said softly, "if life were a code, you would have written it well." Ethan looked up for a moment and, without responding, continued typing. But on his screen appeared a sentence that she read silently. "Thank you for teaching me what cannot be programmed." There were no more words, only the peace of knowing that after so much chaos, they had managed to create a small universe where love had structure and silence, meaning. The following winter arrived with early snowfall, and Vivian's house was once again blanketed in a cozy silence. The wind battered the windows, but inside, an almost sacred peace reigned. Ethan worked from the study, directing his small team, while she baked cookies and listened to the sound of the keys as if it were a familiar melody. On one such night, as she watched the lights twinkle on the Christmas tree, Vivian thought about all they had been through. The despair, the learning, the justice, and most of all, the transformation. It wasn't a perfect story, but it was a true story. One that proved that love doesn't always scream. Sometimes it just holds on, day after day, resisting the test of time. At a virtual Insight Lab meeting, Ethan presented a new project, a system designed to help nonverbal children communicate using visual patterns. When he finished, there was a long silence on the screen, followed by timid applause. Vivian watched him from the aisle, her heart swelling with pride. She had started by caring for a child who couldn't say "mama," and now she saw him helping hundreds of others be heard. That night, before going to sleep, she wrote a sentence in her notebook, a sort of summary of her life. Constancy is also a form of miracle. She closed the notebook, turned off the light, and smiled, knowing that some stories, though born of abandonment, end up filled with purpose. In mid-spring, a local journalist wanted to tell her story again, but this time from a different perspective, that of a grandmother who never gave up. Vivian hesitated, fearing it would reopen wounds, but Ethan convinced her with a simple phrase, "Maybe someone needs to hear it." She agreed, and when the interview was published, messages began pouring in from all over. Mothers, grandmothers, teachers, people who had felt the weight of abandonment or misunderstanding. Many told her that her story had given them hope, that it reminded them that love also means endurance. Vivian read them with tears in her eyes, amazed at how something as mundane as caring for a child could touch so many lives. If this story touched your heart or reminded you of someone struggling in silence, please share it. It might help someone who needs it most today. Sometimes a story told at the right time can be more powerful than any advice. As the months passed, Insight Lab established itself as a benchmark in digital inclusion. Ethan spoke little, but his work spoke for itself. Signed contracts, charity projects, and scholarships for neurodivergent youth. At the entrance to the small building, a plaque read, "Dedicated to Vivian Cooper, who believed when no one else would." Upon reading it, she just smiled. She didn't need tributes. Knowing that her grandson had found his place in the world was enough. That day she returned home, poured herself a cup of tea, and looked at the yellow cup on the table. It was still there, a symbol of everything they had built. The years passed with the serenity of a job well done. Ethan turned 23, and although he still avoided social events, he had learned to communicate in other ways. His words, few but precise, were always accompanied by concrete actions. Each new project he launched from Insight Lab was proof that difference should not only be tolerated, but celebrated. Vivian, her hair now completely white, attended the meetings via video call, sitting in front of the old computer he had repaired years before. She didn't understand all the technical terms, but she did understand the deeper meaning of what she saw. The boy who once couldn't stand noise now led a choir of brilliant minds, each contributing their own rhythm to the same beat. Sometimes at night, as the house fell into darkness, Vivian would stare at Ethan's old drawings. Those lines she had once thought chaotic now seemed like a form of secret writing, a prophecy. Everything was in them: order, repetition, harmony. Each stroke was a testament to the path she had taken. She thought of Rachel, of how time had softened the wound, and of how much she had learned. Without wanting to be a teacher, Life, she understood, doesn't always reward those who teach, but rather those who never stop learning. She closed her eyes with gratitude, letting the silence envelop her once more. The clock struck 10, and the pendulum, tireless, continued repeating the same movement that had accompanied her entire life. Constant, patient, eternal. As time passed, Vivian and Ethan's story became an example cited in conferences and articles on neurodiversity. But at home, nothing had changed. They still ate dinner at the same time, with the same worn floral tablecloth and the same yellow glass on the table. Sometimes, when the wind rustled through the trees in the garden, Vivian would stare at the reflection of the monitor on her grandson's face and think of that blue glow as a kind of intangible inheritance, the light of understanding. She no longer feared the future. She knew that whatever happened, Ethan had learned the most important, and also the most difficult, lesson: to transform abandonment into purpose. One Sunday, while he was checking his company emails, he received an unexpected message. It was from Rachel. She didn't ask for money or apologies. She simply wrote, "Thank you for not teaching him to hate me." Ethan read the sentence silently and showed it to his grandmother. She nodded with a serenity that needed no words. They didn't reply to the email. There was no need for that. Some closures don't require conversation, only understanding. That message didn't erase the past, but it did confirm that everyone, even those who fail, can find redemption. Vivian looked out the window, watching the sun slip through the leaves, and knew that, finally, everything was in its place. That afternoon, Ethan decided to take her for a walk in the park where they used to walk when he was a child. The same gravel path, the same trees that had once frightened him with their shadows, now seemed to accompany him like old friends. Vivian walked slowly, holding his arm, and thought about how many times she had walked that path alone, looking for him, afraid she wouldn't know how to help him. Now, he was the one calmly guiding her, attentive to her every step, as if time had reversed their roles. When they reached the lake, they sat on the same bench as always. Ethan opened his notebook, the same green one where he jotted down his thoughts, and wrote something before showing it to her. "You don't have to understand everything to love." She smiled, knowing that those words contained everything life had taught them. The sun began to set behind the trees, tinting the sky in shades of gold and violet. Vivian closed her eyes for a moment, letting the cool air caress her face. She felt the presence of Harold, her deceased husband, and Rachel in some distant corner of her memory, as if all the fragments of their history had finally found balance. Ethan silently took a photograph with his phone, the image of his grandmother, gazing at the horizon, the lake reflecting the last ray of light. That photo would later be framed and hung above his desk, next to the first drawings he had made as a child. Deep down, he knew his entire life was a continuation of that gaze, patient, steady, and full of love. In the following months, Vivian's health began to weaken, without any drama, as if her body knew its mission was accomplished. Still, she refused to stop teaching. She gave online tutoring classes to children with learning difficulties using her old computer. "I don't want knowledge to die with me," she said with a tired smile. Ethan watched her from the doorway, admiring that energy that defied the passage of time. In the evenings, they would sit together in the living room, she with her wool blanket and he with his laptop, sharing a silence so comfortable it seemed like an old-fashioned conversation that didn't need words. In that silence, they both knew not to fear goodbye, because what they had experienced, had already united them forever. One spring morning, Vivian didn't come down for breakfast. Ethan went up to her room and found her asleep, her hands clasped on her chest, and an expression of absolute serenity. On the nightstand lay a note written in her firm handwriting. "Remember, son, love is also taught with patience." There were no tears or screams, just a deep, reverent silence. Ethan sat next to her and remained motionless for hours, watching the clock tick down. Then he went down to the Kitchen made their usual breakfast and put the yellow cup back in its place just as it always did. It was his way of continuing the lesson. Years passed and the house remained exactly as she had left it. Ethan never changed a thing. The curtains, the furniture, the books stacked on the dining room table. He only added one new photo to the front shelf, that of Vivian on the park bench, watching the sunset. Every morning as he passed by it, he paused for a few seconds as if still waiting to hear her voice correcting something or giving him an instruction. But what comforted him most was knowing that nothing was left unfinished between them. His grandmother had taught him all the essentials: patience, discipline, and above all, the conviction that true love doesn't need a physical presence to last. Years later, when Insight Lab expanded to other countries, Ethan traveled to give a conference on innovation and empathy in technology. He took the stage with his usual unassuming manner, dressed in a white shirt and a small gold watch-shaped pin. He spoke little, but each word resonated powerfully. My grandmother used to say that time isn't measured in seconds, but in consistency. I learned this by watching her teach without giving up. The audience rose to applaud, and he, for the first time, looked up and smiled. Somewhere in the background, he thought he saw a familiar figure, a white-haired woman holding a cup of tea, nodding silently. He didn't know if it was his imagination or his wish, but he preferred to believe it was real. Upon returning from that trip, Ethan returned to the Portland house, to the same neighborhood where it all began. The grandfather clock continued to tick with its steady cadence, and the garden, which Vivian devotedly tended, flourished as if the earth itself remembered his hands. He sat on the porch with a cup of tea, mimicking his routine, and gazed at the horizon. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel emptiness, but gratitude. Absence had transformed into presence, one that inhabited every corner, every daily gesture. On his desk, the yellow cup was still there, untouched, like a small domestic altar. Beside it, the green notebook awaited new ideas. But that afternoon, instead of writing code, Ethan wrote a sentence. Nothing we truly love is lost. It only changes form. Years later, when the world recognized his work and his name became synonymous with ethical innovation, Ethan avoided interviews and tributes. He always responded the same way. The credit isn't mine. It belongs to the person who taught me to look with patience. On the door of Insight Lab, beneath the plaque dedicated to Vivian Cooper, someone added a small inscription that became the motto of all who worked there. Love can also be programmed, if you write it consistently. And so, as time passed, the story of that teacher and her grandson was engraved not only in algorithms and lines of code, but in the silent memories of those who learned, thanks to them, that tenderness can also change the world.